Hello, everybody. Welcome to Sweetspot Safari again. Our usual format. We've got Ben Miller, myself today, but we've also invited along a new explorer, Allard De Jong, who's a very interesting gentleman. And we'll be talking today about the topic a bit different, saints versus sinners, but still following the theme of looking at polarities. And as always, our topics are sort of heavily nuanced and very contextual, and we're just going to let the discussion flow. So hopefully you will enjoy that. So first of all, I'm going to ask Allard to introduce himself, and then ask him, why he chose the particular topic of saints versus sinners. So over to you, Allard, please.
John, I like what you said when you introduced me. You said an interesting gentleman. And that can mean, the word interesting can mean so many different things, can't it? We say,
yes, it does. I meant in a very positive light, obviously, Allard. Yeah.
Right. A peculiar young man. I'm originally from Holland and lived and worked in many different parts of the world, and I've settled down in Brussels, Belgium for the last 3 years. So that's where I'm calling in from now. Married with 2 grown-up children and a team coach by trade. So I spent most of my time helping teams in organizations of all kinds collaborate better, and thereby hopefully contributing to a more kind of collaborative world that seems to need it. When you look at the wicked problems that we're up against, I think it's becoming more and more clear in people's minds that we can't solve those by ourselves, and have to take a more kind of systemic approach and collaborative approach to problem solving. So yeah, that's what I do when I'm not busy having fun with people like yourselves.
Thank you. So yeah, it's, as I say, people will have seen some of our other topics so far, and we are trying to explore, as you say, that middle ground as best we can. So I'm really intrigued about the topic of saints versus sinners, because I went on to Wikipedia actually to go and have a look at the definitions, and it said it hadn't got any definitions, which was quite interesting because normally those sort of things are, and I use Wiki because usually there's a bit more richer content than the dictionary definition. I'm sure there's out there, but I think this is so heavily nuanced, it'd be really interesting to just explore it. So again, Allard, why did you, this really intriguing topic, why did you choose it?
Well, I think you often talk about a world that is increasingly polarized, right? And you see it every day in the news, and in whatever conflict that we hear about, there's always the good guys and the bad guys, right? There's always the saints and the sinners. And when I think about that, I wonder if anyone really is ever completely one or the other, or if we as human, given our peculiar fate as human beings, as a peculiar fate as a species on this planet, and maybe in whatever cosmology you kind of look at us through, whatever lens you take on this, a spiritual lens or a philosophical lens or a purely everyday common sense kind of sense lens. Yeah, I really wonder if we are one, or if some people are just inherently saintly, and if others are born sinners. There's one for the Catholic school boys, isn't there? Mm-hmm. Are we, the whole notion of original sin, or is it to what extent is it up to us, to choose that, and to what, well, and to what extent do we have a choice, really?
Yeah.
And so
the whole concept.
No.
So this whole concept of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and what lenses that we use as well. So I'd like to bring Ben in here, if that's okay, because I know that you had a more religious upbringing than myself, and I know you've got some interesting perspectives on your experiences, Ben.
Yeah, well, I won't go on too much about my experience, but I grew up a Catholic, and it was something. Well, I went to church every Sunday, and part of the rituals is to routinely visit the box and kneel in front of the priest and share my sins as a young kid, and ask for forgiveness and go and say a few Hail Marys in the church afterwards. And it was an interesting experience for me, which as a young boy you don't really understand what it's doing to your psyche, but I just wonder how that has shaped me into later years. And I stopped going to church really when I was probably about 16 and old enough to go out and drink and socialize. And yeah, it's made me kind of think about shame and guilt, and constantly thinking about loads of things which you do, which are ordinary part of everyday life, as sins. I just wonder how much of that kind of process, that ritual, is shaping guilt and shame in society. That's just kind of one thought which comes to mind. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm not going to say too much now because I want to bring Allard back in here as well because of his experience as team coaches. What you've just described there seems to be a lot of judgment of others about you, but also judging yourself to a certain extent. And I know, Allard, you deal with this, and we've had long discussions before about the whole coaching principles of non-judgment. So it'd be interesting to get some further reflections from you.
Yeah. I think that so life is this never-ending series of polarities, right? And your show makes that very, very clear. And if we explicitly recognize one aspect of a polarity in ourselves, I think we imply the other side of that polarity. But you see this all the time in business, don't you? In people working together and in with teams where this judgment going on. We don't have to go as far as a Russia-Ukraine conflict, but you see it in corporations where the marketing team are the saints and it's all the fault of the sales team who are the sinners. And but again, if we recognize one aspect of ourselves, then the other aspect, what's the word?
Antithesis.
Antithesis. Yeah.
Thank you. Is implicitly there, and maybe both sides of that polarity have I guess that one side of that polarity is always more developed in us, and of course that's more developed, and that comes with certain benefits. Maybe our saintly behavior has certain benefits, whatever we mean by saintly behavior, and we can talk about all kinds of virtues related to that. But maybe it's interesting to then help people explore what the other side of that is, and what the cost might be of just trying to be a saint the whole time at work or outside of work. It's funny. I don't know if I have to admit I got a lot of books, but I haven't read all of them. But I did dabble a bit in the Divine Comedy by Dante, and of course Dante on his way through purgatory and all that. I mean, comes across a whole bunch of sinners in hell, but also comes across the occasional saint in purgatory who are being cleansed of their sins. The saints have to be cleansed of their sins. So maybe it all goes back to that good old yin yang symbol where well, first of all, where the black needs the white in order to be black, and the white needs the black in order to be defined as white, because if there's only white, then it's no longer white. So as I think it was Alan Watts back in the 60s who said, the saints need the sinners and vice versa. The in crowd needs an out crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think to your point, we think of saints and sinners as maybe individuals and symbols, but what they're reflecting perhaps back to us is the values of good and evil, which I think is useful. And I'm just interested actually in how these ideas about good and evil, or saints and sinners, evolve over time? Are they universal values and ideals, and they just morph into different contexts? So one useful distinction I've heard people talk about is that for most of human history there was God, and then the scientific revolution along with capitalism, then there was no God. And actually, maybe what comes next, God will be everywhere again. So I'm intrigued by saints and sinners in the scientific worldview, the kind of capitalist system context which we're in now. How has that shifted our views on saints and sinners?
Yeah, if that's all right, Ben, I want to come in on that one, because it was interesting when I was doing some of the research. Historically, to your point around God, was that a lot of the virtues and whatever you want to call them, saintly behaviors, were all associated with religion, a bit like the Ten Commandments, etc., which is quite interesting. But what we're seeing now, I think, in the business world is, and with some of the intergenerational cultural problems that we've got, is those lines are getting very much fuzzied now. One person's virtue, as a more elderly citizen, is not the same as a younger person's virtue. And we get into the whole things about the end justifies the means. I know something very passionate you're very passionate about, Ben, is around the influence of digital and social media on the world and stuff. So there seems to be some polarity there, but also again a fuzziness and an overlap as well. So again, Allard, what's your thoughts or reflections on that?
I don't know if there is, to what extent there's a universal set of desirable virtues, right, or virtuous values. I think I've traveled a lot, and I've had the opportunity to do work literally on every continent on this planet, and I always find that we have a lot more in common than what we have, than our differences. It's really been my experience that we kind of inherently, no matter where you go on this planet, you know what's good, and maybe goes back to that good old golden rule. I mean, every culture on this planet has one version or another of what we call the golden rule, as treat other people like you want to be treated. That is just inherently human. So I think we're instinctively, no matter where we come from, I think we instinctively recognize what is virtuous and what is not, or what is saint and what is sinner. But again, I think we're all capable of both.
Mm. And I guess I kind of think about how, when contexts change, how that influences how we act and respond, and particularly now there seems to be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change, whether it's technology, whether it's environmental stuff, whether it's social systems collapse, whatever it might be. Actually, when our contexts change, it seems to create these kind of like polarities. So it almost seems like it shines a spotlight and crystallizes these different paths. Any kind of views on kind of where we are now, and maybe how context shapes this dynamic?
I think context definitely shapes it. I think there's if you look at if you think of the concept of identity, right, of self, or having a self and being a certain way, I think there's two ways of thinking about that. Some people would say that that's very fixed. We are who we are how we are, and that's me, that's ourself, that's myself. But then in fields like in other areas like Gestalt psychology takes a much more fluid view of self. And you could actually talk about not self, but selfing, with turning it into an ing kind of verb, selfing, which is constantly adjusting in the best way it knows to circumstances. And that resonates a lot more with my own experience of almost a bit more of a chameleon kind of approach to to reacting what happens in us and what happens around us. But I agree. I mean, it's the problem with that whole yin yang thing again, with the whole black and white, if you interpret that the wrong way, it becomes, and this goes back to Alan Watts again, who talked about this so beautifully. It becomes a game of black against white or white against black, and and we seem to live in a world where we believe that one of those two has to win, which of course, again, is just philosophically, it's impossible, because one only exists by virtue of the other.
Yeah.
And I think what I really like about the Sweetspot Safari, it's when you look at the drawing of the yin yang, you have those two fishes, right? That the black and the white, but they're both held by a circle. And maybe that's indicative of the sweet spot, where are we able to maybe elevate ourselves above the black and the white? Are we above that inherent duality that comes with human life on this planet? We live in ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, we've descended into duality. But can we rise up enough to somehow focus on the oneness that holds that duality? I think that's the way out. That's the way forward in all of this. So maybe saying, okay, saint, sinner, maybe yes, we are both, and the saint contains a little bit of the sinner, and the sinner contains a little bit of the saint. Even Scrooge in Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol. Scrooge, a horrible person at the beginning, isn't he? But actually turns out not too bad at the end of the story. So. But then that's the whole story of what is it? Repentance and redemption, and
yeah.
But it's that is selfing, isn't it? That is a selfing.
No, absolutely. And it was interesting while you were talking, I was thinking also as sort of slightly left field about the concept of manipulation and victimhood. I quickly did a quick search on, who could be considered as saints and who could be considered as sinners, and I think if we put apart the fact that people have different values and different lenses on these, typically the saints were coming up with people like, some of them religious, Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lamas, religious leaders, etc. Some of the sinners were people like some of the Roman emperors who had bad behavior, some of in the financial and business world, which we've not really touched on yet, Donald Trump, Bernie Madoff, and all this sort of stuff. But it's quite interesting. The other one that popped up was Christine Keeler, if people remember the story of the perfumer affair. And at the time, she was seen very much as a sinner, what she did in terms of encouraging people into relationships for secrets and everything else. But recently, she's been considered as a bit of a victim because she was manipulated as well. So I think the point I'm trying to make there is that things can shift, as you say. Saints can be sinners, and people can move on like Scrooge, and people can repent. But is it just people are originally that way because of some sort of manipulation that goes on? Which is, if we look at the whole question of misogyny at the moment, which is very, very high profile, there's a lot of talk about manipulation as well, which again I think sort of is a great debate to have. We need to deal with it, but it sort of muddies the waters a bit, and I think it brings things together. There is no this, to your yin and the yang, with the soft line, the circle around it. There's no defined border between the two.
Yeah,
and your selfing concept was intriguing. I haven't actually come across it, but it did make me think about whether it's a useful distinction to map onto saints and sinners, selfishness and self-interest versus selfless or altruistic behavior. And I think that we tend to think that all ego is bad, and we need to kind of get rid of it entirely. But actually, ego is just really about a constant development. We need to think about ourselves. We need to think about others. I don't know if there's a kind of connection there between how we think about sin and saintly behavior.
Yeah, You know, one idea that's always been really useful to me is this idea that everybody's doing the best they can with what they have at any given moment, right? Even so, all of the examples of the people that you mentioned in the, you know, the Donald Trumps of this world, I'm absolutely convinced that Donald Trump's doing the best that he can with what he has in a given moment. And you know, the boss at work who's you know, who's very critical of all of the people that he works with, and his team complains because of all the criticism that he gives them, and you know, might actually be led to call him, you know, an absolutely horrible person, and qualify him with all kinds of bad adjectives. But when you think about that, so you know, that boss that gives direct criticism to everybody clearly shows that he's expedient, he or she is expedient, it can be very clear in their communication. So there's a lot of, you know, they're trying something, right? They're trying to be efficient. They're trying to show their ability to execute, but while they do that, it becomes very clear that the other side of that polarity is not well developed. So they don't have much ability to filter, maybe they don't have much ability to slow down, or they don't have much ability to accept what comes their way. And that of course comes with a cost, frustration, tension, you know, missed deadlines in the team, lost focus on work in the team, etc. So I think, so if we can help people who sit on one side of whatever kind of polarity, leaning more towards the saint or more towards the sin, and it is in the eye of the beholder, like you said, John, at the very beginning. If we can help them understand what's well developed in their behavior, what they already do well, or what they do a lot of, and then by contrast show them what's less developed, or what might be developing in them, and then show them the cost of those two things, then I think you have a chance of bringing people more towards that middle ground that we're looking for.
Yeah,
but I don't think great. But think of the worst behaviors. Think of all the things that you would tell your kids never to do. Never lie, never steal, never do this or that. And then really, when you take some distance from all of those affirmations and you go, isn't it contextual? Could it be that there is a time in your life where it's actually okay or advisable to lie?
Well,
you know,
that's a really
example.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because that also ties in with some of the concepts. Sometimes the end justifies the means. You know, there's the concept of the white lie. And if you look at the level of activism going on, you know, bringing it forward to the modern day that's going on in the world, you know, a lot of these people, you know, whether it's, you know, and I'm not judging any of them, but the trans movement or the environmentalist movement, they firmly believe when you hear them that the end justifies the means, right? And arguably they are, you know, against some of the old values, are therefore, you know, they're sinning as well. You know, if we can bring it back to ego a bit, which was really interesting, the names that you mentioned there, Allard, and your point as well, Ben, around the fact that sometimes ego serves us. If you look at, and I'm thinking again at thinking of engineering construction, if you look at historically, if we take some examples in the UK, people like Brunel, you know, who built, you know, roads, bridges, you know, buildings, you know, steam engines and steamships and stuff, you know, he didn't do that without a strong personality, and certainly had very, very strong ego. So there is this time where, you know, having this ego does serve us, you know, and again, it can be looked at in two different ways, you know. It seems to be, as you've said, you know, very fluid. And again, you know, open to either of you in terms of any thoughts or reflections on that.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to jump in, Allard.
Well, I think it is very fluid, because we just had an example. I just used an example of somebody who was perceived as a sinner by their team. But now imagine, you know, another boss who's really perceived as a saint to their team because they spend a lot of time with each of their direct reports. As a result of which they're sometimes late at other appointments because, you know, they really want to spend time with everyone. And so clearly what they're doing well is, you know, or what's well developed is that ability to care about the team, a certain thoroughness, you know, and a desire to really want to explore everybody's personal reality. But what's less well developed is their ability to maybe disconnect from a situation or achieve closure, or the ability to headline or highlight certain things. And again, that will come with a cost too. And you know, they're getting behind. Sometimes it's disruptive. It may actually set the wrong example for certain people, etc. So, so again, what I'm trying to say is that, yeah, who's the better boss, the first one or the second one? I think they're both trying to do the best that they can at any given moment. But they're both focusing on one side of a polarity. And that doesn't mean that they have to stop doing what they're doing and completely engage in the opposite, in the antithesis, or antithetical behavior, I guess you would say. But really, to explore that middle ground, because there's so much, there is so much middle ground between one extreme and the other.
Yeah, I think when you were talking a few moments ago about people, whoever they are, we might view them as perhaps being, you know, evil or, you know, doing bad things, you know, at that moment. But, you know, being able to zoom out and seeing, you know, the kind of history of where they've come from and where they're perhaps going to. And I think about my own context of how I learn. I'm very much a learner who tries things. So I kind of try, I experiment, trial and error type of learning, where inherently you're learning through mistakes. You know, and those mistakes might be, you know, inconsequential. That, you know, it's something, you know, I fail in an exam. But actually, some of those mistakes are, you know, relational, or they might be, you know, kind of moral or ethical. You know, you mentioned, you know, lying and stealing. You know, not saying that, you know, I've actively done those things, but when we kind of grow up, we're trying to understand rules and norms and, you know, ways of conducting ourselves in different environments. We're not pre-programmed. You know, we're not hardwired to kind of, you know, automatically do the kind of right thing. And so I'm just kind of trying to understand that, you know, learning by mistakes is really how we learn. So, and also just where is the kind of process of forgiveness gone in our society as well?
Yeah.
I think that then what you're describing is, you know, we just to sort of build on that, is how we push our boundaries. And sometimes that process of pushing the boundaries, you know, with a particular lens, a line can be crossed. But your point about forgiveness, I think, is very, very important. You know, sometimes in order to build relationships, for instance, we talk about, and I know, Allard, you talked about collaboration a lot, which is great, is this business of unconditional collaboration. In order to do that, there needs to be sometimes a level of forgiveness. You know, it becomes quite often where there's a debate or a dispute or something like that, somebody's got to sort of square the circle, for want of a better word, and make things move forward. It's a bit like the union negotiations. You know, if we go tit for tat, nothing's ever going to move forward. So you've got to find a way, and sometimes you have to, you know, I was thinking as you were talking there, Ben, sometimes you have, the expression is you have to give to get, right? So in other words, you give unconditionally, you know, and that could be like forgiveness. You give somebody as part of a dispute in order to get back the relationship, for instance, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think in what you're both saying, I think we have to draw the distinction between identity and what people do, between who people are and what they do, right? So this notion of making mistakes, that's at a doing level, that I making level, I made a mistake. That doesn't mean that I am a mistake. Or from the world of so we talked about Gestalt psychology, but another field, you know, transactional analysis, a whole other school of thought about psychology, right, with its own models and ways of thinking. They developed this thing called the OK corral, and we may have talked about this in a different context, but what it says is that I can think of myself as basically inherently okay, or as something, or as there being something really wrong with me, and therefore I'm inherently not okay, right? And I can think of you at the same way, John or Ben. I can think of, yeah, Ben, you know, he's inherently okay, or I can think of Ben as some inherently wrong person, right? And so when you cross those two, you get one of these four quadrant kind of, you know, one of these four quadrant kind of diagrams where I can, you know, I can think of the situation as me not being okay and you not being okay. So, you know, the whole world is going to hell and there's nothing good about me or about you or anyone. Or I can think of myself, and here you really start to polarize. You see this a lot, like I'm okay, but you're not okay. And variations thereof, right? I'm right and you're wrong. Or I have to have power over you, or I have to be smarter than you, or I'm inherently more valuable than you. Therefore, my rights should take precedence over yours. And the other extreme of that, which would be that you know, you see people going through life in terms of I'm not okay, but if only I could be more like you, because you're definitely, you know, you've got everything that I want, and I've got nothing, and so you become, it's a very submissive, rather very passive, rather than that, you know, as opposed to that more aggressive kind of approach. But obviously, where the model wants us, where the psychologists want to take us, is to the I'm okay and you're okay. And the beautiful thing about that is that if we can see each other as inherently okay, even though we all make mistakes, you know, even though we may have really behaved like a, what's a polite word? Even though we may have behaved like a sinner, to use our language of the day, that doesn't make me a sinner. That doesn't make me inherently not okay.
You describing the kind of process of maturity, or, you know, kind of wisdom, you know, is it yeah, I think we have this yeah, and you know, I still experience it, and you know, I have a mental model knowing that it's wrong, and actually I'm able to catch myself, you know, doing it and being part of that dynamic. But you mentioned earlier on that you've worked and, you know, traveled widely. I'm kind of curious actually whether you think this is particularly a post-Christian Western issue, this duality, and whether perhaps other more you know, regions, whether it's China or other parts of Asia, who think relationally, or kind of more, you know, in kind of context, or the whole, if you like. And you mentioned Gestalt psychology. Yeah, I just wonder whether it's a kind of Western, particularly a Western dynamic, and whether other, you know, cultures suffer from it.
Yeah, I'm not an expert, but you talked about Catholicism, and you know, and of course in the Western Christian way of thinking, we're born original sinners, right? We're born out of original sin. That's the and I don't know much about other religions, a little bit, but in Islam, for example, that's the exact opposite. We're born inherently good. Our inherent nature is inherently good. And I think that sets you up in life in a completely different way, at least not with the same amount of guilt that the Judeo-Christian tradition comes with. I don't know. The word, so this word sin is interesting, right? Because especially the more like scriptural use of the word sin, and because if you go back to the original Greek word that all of that comes from, it you may have heard this, it points to missing the mark. You know, if you shoot an arrow or something, miss the mark. That's where the word sin comes from. So and I like that way. So you're missing the mark. So you did something that, you know, that's not going to get you where you wanted to get to. That's a sin. It's a simple.
That's really interesting you say that, because I've not actually heard that before, but I find it fascinating, because this idea of missing the mark is sort of implicit, is that, okay, you're not totally good, but you're not too bad either, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're, you know, it's not, you know, there's not a hard boundary between good and bad, or whatever. And I think that's quite interesting, and maybe that definition might help us collaborate a bit more, because to your point earlier on, you know, when you were talking about Donald Trump and others, you know, they believe they're probably trying to do their best at the time, situationally, with all the resources that they had got, but they arguably, in some people's views, had missed the mark. I think what's really interesting, going back to this concept of segregating the self and the identity from the behavior, I think is really powerful, because I think that brings in the concept again of non-judgment. I know when I've been through my personal journey, when I started to be a professional coach, getting my head around the concept of non-judgment was a challenge for me, not because I didn't understand it intellectually, was because in my day-to-day work, as an engineer in the past, I spent all my time taking judgment. And then eventually I had this aha moment. And I think there might be a parallel here, is that it was okay to judge situations because that's what you had to deal with in the moment, but it wasn't okay to, judge people necessarily. And, once I'd made that segregation, I found life a lot richer and a lot easier to deal with. And I think it also possibly links in, I don't know what either of you think about this whole concept of I'm okay, you're okay, which I think is really, really powerful. And maybe the I'm okay, you're okay is one of the sweet spots we're looking for, in terms of the sweet spot safari. I don't know. It'd be interesting to get, either of your perceptions on that.
Yeah, well, there's so much we could talk to. This notion of of identity and behavior is comes from, at least I discovered it through the work of the gentleman called Robert Dilts, D-I-L-T-S, who came up with who sketches this pyramid, which he calls the logical levels, or the levels of learning. And the bottom of the pyramid, you've got, the results, or our environment, stuff that happens around us, right? And he goes, if you want to make a change at that level, you have to do something differently, right? We all know that. You've heard that said. If you want something different, do something different. So you've got that level of results, and then the level of behaviors or action, but in order to do something different, I have to go up one level to a level of skills. I have to develop certain skills. If I want to do something differently, I probably have to learn how to do that differently, or how to do that better. But in order to learn a new skill or develop a new skill, I probably have to value it. So you get to that level of values or beliefs. I believe that I can develop that skill, or I believe that I can't. And then ultimately, where do our beliefs and our values come from? From how we see ourselves, how we define ourselves. So you get to that level of the top of the pyramid. It's been adapted a bit, but the original top of the pyramid was identity. Now, so there's an interesting kind of up and down motion through that, but even more interestingly is that you can imagine a vertical line that runs right through the center of that pyramid. And now imagine those 5 blocks as being able to move relative to each other. You start to notice that line represents our inherent desire for alignment, for congruence. If I think of myself as inherently an honest person, a saint, I would find it difficult to lie at that behavioral level, because all of a sudden those 2 blocks of the pyramid are no longer aligned, so it creates tension, right? And so maybe I can do that once, but eventually it'll shift back. So I think the opportunity we have here is to help people see themselves in it. We're always trying to help people change their behaviors. And that's hard work, because unless there's a shift at the top of that pyramid to accompany that, those behaviors or their values their identity and their values will always pull those behaviors back right in alignment with that imaginary vertical line, with that personal congruence that we're all looking for. So it's no good telling people you should behave like a saint. You should help people see themselves like a saint, or whatever whatever words we're comfortable using.
I think that's a really powerful illustration, Allard. And I think ultimately all of these things are connected, and I get that there's levels, and they all influence and shape each other, both up and down the hierarchy. It does make me think, you kind of clearly painted a picture of it, an individual level, how what's the most effective way intervening in change, and the kind of the beliefs and values are incredibly important. I just wonder about the environments and the systems that we play in each day, and it almost feels like a losing battle, that the kind of capitalist system where actually it's just about accumulation and self-interest and profits, focusing on profit, and I make it more practical in the workplace, that we pretty much know most people aren't simply extrinsically motivated. We have like intrinsic motivations and desires, and you can just generically, the pursuit of meaning and purpose has become commonplace in terms of how we talk about our careers now. So there seems to be like a conflict of values about what our system wants and what a lot of human beings kind of want. And then the same thing I think applies to our social media digital contexts, that algorithms want us to be polarized, outraged, fearful, fearful. But I don't think most people do. And it's kind of creating weird, erratic behaviors, which are probably out of, just not normal for a lot of people. And so we're stuck in this behavioral performance level, both in the workplace quite often, but also in our digital contexts. And it's very difficult to escape that. And so those forces seem huge to me. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Just while it goes through my mind, when you were talking about the algorithms, for instance, they seem, the way you've described them, then, is they're driven by performance and a need. The system is driven by performance and need to perform, which is driven by competitiveness, right? Trying to get one step ahead. The person who's doing the algorithms for one platform wants to be better than the person who's doing the algorithms for the other platform. And it seems as though there's that escalation, and we know that escalation can drive even more polarity. So I think there's a very interesting analogy there, as you described. And again, that's sort of extrinsic, the system, and goes against, as you say, Ben, potentially some of our personal beliefs and our intrinsic motivations as a human being. So I think that in itself is very fascinating. And of course, then there's a question, of course, is where's the end game for that, right?
Yeah, it's also fascinating, Ben, because there's a gentleman called Otto Scharmer from MIT, from the MIT Sloan Institute. There's a lot of thinking about these things, and one of his I heard him say, and I love this, he goes, we are collectively creating results that nobody wants.
Yeah, great. That's spot on, isn't it? Simple.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Why do we do that? I don't know. There's something very peculiar about humans. But what I do know, and this is from Yuval Noah Harari, right? One, that Israeli writer who explains our species so well. He goes, we change when we believe in a different story. And so this whole notion of capitalism is a story, right? Just as religion is a story. I'm not judging it. And different religions offer different stories. And when enough people buy into a similar story, we collaborate. And so his example of money as a story, we believe these little pieces of paper have value. Well, thank God we do, because the day we find out that they're absolutely, since we disconnected from the gold standard, money has absolutely no value except psychologically. But as long as people believe in the same story, we can do absolutely incredible things. So I think that in order to stop creating the results, collectively creating results that nobody wants, somebody has to come up with a better story.
Yeah.
And then get enough people to believe in that. But that, and I want to share something with you, because I wrote it down earlier today, because I thought I got to bring this in. The French philosopher Blaise Pascal, one of his books called His Thoughts, Les Pensées. This is 1670. 1670. He goes, what then is to become of man and mankind? Will he, okay, now we should say he or she, but I'm saying it like he said it. Will he be the equal of God or the beasts? What a terrifying distance. What then shall he be? Who cannot see from all this that man is lost, that he has fallen from his place, that he anxiously seeks it and cannot find it again? And who then is to direct him there? The greatest men have failed. So, and this is 1670. This is a long time ago. And it's like, what will we be, saints or sinners? What a terrifying distance.
Yeah, and it's probably just it's a story which, story and human predicament, which is probably, eternal. And it is interesting how just different thinkers through the ages are thinking, similar things. But I do like your idea about story and narrative, because this really does shape, how we think. It shapes our worldview. It's the idea of humans as, savages, or, our evolutionary story is one purely of competition and domination, which ignores, perhaps our altruistic and cooperative nature. I think that's really important. And I think it's Rudolf Steiner, who and I think also other thinkers such as I think, is it Marvin Harris? There's lots of different social thinkers and philosophers who think about society as basically three spheres or three domains: one of culture, one of governance, and one of production, or the economy. And another way to think about it is the culture is our superstructure, which is our narrative, our story, our beliefs, which influences how we govern, our social structures, law and order, and also our means of production, our infrastructure, our economy, whether it's energy and kind of goods. And you can't. We tend to focus a lot on the production. And the economy, and the economy almost is like eating up our kind of government and cultural spheres. And actually, we kind of, I think, to your point, we just need a new story. We need a new story about who we are, and where we're heading.
Well, Ben and John, may the Sweetspot Safari lead us to a new.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that was an absolutely great point to end on there, this whole idea of the narrative and the story. And, yes, again, Ben, your point about the three spheres, etc. It's just really going to be interesting, because I think we are going to be going forward for more related topics, and trying to find that sweet spot is going to be a real challenge, but it's really fun. And it's great to explore with both of you today the thoughts, the reflections, the concepts, the experiences on this particularly very interesting topic. And I would personally, from Ben and myself, like to thank you, Allard, today for giving up your time for this. It's been really elevating, I think, and fascinating. And for the readers and listeners, I hope you enjoyed this one, and look forward to our next adventure, shall we say, our exploration on Sweetspot Safari. So thank you much indeed from us all, and thank you for listening, and thank you for Allard again, please.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Allard, from me. It's been enjoyable.
See you soon.
Take care.